Where to now, Ace?
Home.
Home?
The TARDIS.
Yes, the TARDIS. There are worlds out there where the sky's burning, where the sea's asleep and the rivers dream. People made of smoke and cities made of song. Some of there's danger, some of there's injustice, and somewhere else the tea's getting cold. Come on, Ace. We've got work to do.
The final episode of Classic Doctor Who was aired on December 6, 1989, as Part 3 of Survival. Despite the show's long history of being commissioned for another season every year, producer John Nathan Turner suspected that season 26 would be the last for some time, or possibly even forever. To address this, he asked script editor Andrew Cartmel to write a melancholic monologue for the 7th Doctor actor Sylvester McCoy to record on November the 23rd, coincidentally the show's 26th birthday, as an intentional open-ended conclusion. It was no shock to observers that Doctor Who was eventually cancelled. Despite narrowly avoiding being axed during the Colin Baker era, the BBC had effectively doomed the show by changing its broadcast time and reducing its budget, leading to a steady decline in ratings that ultimately justified their reasoning for the cancellation. It was also generally accepted that the show passed its peak and had lost its former glory. However, John Nathan Turner and Andrew Cartmel were attempting to rejuvenate the show by introducing fresh concepts, and the story arc would have been concluded in season 27 if it had not been for the eventual cancellation. But how? Let us delve into this era of the 7th Doctor and the Cartmel Masterplan. It's late 1986. Doctor Who had just gone through a difficult period during the 6th Doctor's tenure, facing criticisms of its tone and a failed attempt to cancel it by Michael Grade, as well as poor reviews of the season 23 story arc, The Trial of a Time Lord. Going into season 24, producer John Nathan Turner faced multiple challenges. The role of the Doctor was vacant following Colin Baker's removal at the request of the BBC. The show had no script editor after Eric Saywood walked away during the previous season, and the BBC had moved the show from its Saturday evening slot to a Monday evening slot, directly competing with the popular ITV soap opera Coronation Street. Eventually, John Nathan Turner chose comedic actor Sylvester McCoy to play the 7th Doctor. At the suggestion of his agent, he brought in the young and inexperienced Andrew Cartmel as script editor. However, by the time Cartmel joined, the plans for the 4 stories in season 24 had virtually been decided. This brought problems before the 7th Doctor era had even begun. The first story of season 24, Time and the Rani, was written by Pip and Jane Baker without any input from the script editor, leaving the characterization of the Doctor in question. As a result, throughout most of season 24, the Doctor was portrayed as clumsy and comically bumbling, drawing on Sylvester McCoy's background in physical comedy. In addition, producer John Nathan Turner had gone through a complete overhaul of the show, akin to season 18 when he initially took on the role. Other than Pip and Jane Baker, he leaned towards fresh writing talent in Stephen Wyatt, Malcolm Cole, and Ian Briggs to pen the rest of season 24 stories. The decision was made to also drop the companion Mel, who had joined partway through season 23 and had never been given a proper introduction, nor gained much popularity from fans. Originally, the new companion was to be a female character called Ray, who appeared in the 3rd story of the season, Delta and the Bannermen. However, this idea was dropped, and instead the new companion would be Ace, a troubled teenager who debuted in the season 24 finale Dragonfire, a character who was drawn from writer Ian Briggs' experience of some students he taught at drama school. You could argue that the character was arguably the first building block of the Cartmel Masterplan. By and large, season 24 can be viewed as unimpressive by Doctor Who standards. Wholesale changes amongst the backdrop of a tougher condition set by the BBC results in 4 stories that are basic and almost childlike in narrative, lacking any meaningful depth for the most part. In comparison to the next 2 seasons, you can see the lack of direction from the script editor, given Andrew Cartmel's latest addition to the team, and in regard to the characterization of the Doctor, a somewhat resort to default in the actor's background. All this, though, would soon change. With season 24 behind them, the focus shifted to season 25, which was also the show's 25th anniversary. Script editor Andrew Cartmel had a clear vision for the storylines, but what exactly was his concept that became to be known as the Cartmel Masterplan? Firstly, the Cartmel Masterplan wasn't a definitive manifesto set out by Cartmel to producer John Nathan Turner. In fact, the term was invented by fans that was later popularised by Doctor Who magazine. Instead, the Cartmel Masterplan was best described by writer Mark Platt as a mood and direction for the show, rather than a distinctive plan. The set of ideas was born out of Andrew Cartmel's disapproval that the character of the Doctor had lost the veneer of mystery, compared to when we were first introduced to the character back in 1963, who we knew very little about. By the late 1980s, there wasn't much left to tell about the character, with more and more of his background revealed seemingly in tandem with the more exposure the Time Lords and the Doctor's home planet of Gallifrey had received over the years. To bring back this mystery, changes were made to the character of the Seventh Doctor. Out went the clown-like comical persona to replace with a more manipulative, darker character of someone who knew what was coming and had already begun setting the traps for the antagonists before the story had even begun. For its 25th anniversary season, Doctor Who kicked off with a bold statement through the first story, Remembrance of the Daleks. Dalek tales had always been a crowd pleaser in the Doctor Who universe, and the anniversary seemed like the perfect opportunity to revisit them. But instead of the typical Dalek stories from the likes of Terry Nation, David Whittaker and Eric Saywood, newcomer Ben Aranovich introduced a fresh take that aligned with Cartmel's vision. He brought the show back to its roots, setting it in the Shoreditch area of London in 1963, specifically around Coal Hill High School and Foreman's Scrapyard. This marked a return to the origins of their first story, An Unearthly Child. This in turn presented us with the Doctor having established a long game, an ultimate trap for two factions of Daleks battling it out amongst each other for the Time Lord device, the Hand of Omega, which the Doctor had previously had in his possession during his first incarnation. Additionally, when presented with questions from Ace and other characters, the Doctor responds without a direct answer, rather a vagueness about how much he actually knows or is letting on. The newly reformed mystery of the Doctor was extended in another one of Season 25's stories, Silver Nemesis, with characters such as Lady Penfort questioning who the Doctor actually is, and once more, the Doctor diverting the attention from any probing questions that Ace was asking. Also, there was this hint from the Doctor that he was more than just an ordinary Time Lord, which was alluded across both Remembrance of the Daleks and Silver Nemesis. Season 25 proved to be a step up from its predecessor, the inclusion of the Daleks and Cybermen, particularly for the 25th anniversary, but also the new character development of the Seventh Doctor. Although not all stories revolve around the Doctor's mysterious background, the other two offered depth and reflection on real-life narratives. Graham Curry's The Happiness Patrol may have appeared in a similar vein to Season 24, with its focus on a planet that mandates happiness as well as the controversial Candyman character. But it also satirises the Thatcherism of 1980s British politics, with the portrayal of the main antagonist, Helen A, by Sheila Hancock, being inspired by Margaret Thatcher herself. The final story of Season 25, The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, carried a similar vein with a plot centred around a psychic circus where the performers must put on shows to survive. However, beneath the surface, the antagonists, who have godlike powers, are reminiscent of previous villains like Sutekh and the Black Guardian. The story, written by Stephen Wyatt, cleverly parodies Doctor Who and its relationship with fans and its constant evaluation by the BBC hierarchy. Additionally, we viewed more of Ace's character, in particular her fears and what scared her. If Season 25 had started to hint at the Cartmel Masterplan, then Season 26 went about fully exposing it, in addition to making Ace a much more central character to the narrative as arguably the Doctor. The narratives also become even darker, as did the Doctor, which is represented in his new outfit with his white jacket, now replaced with a darker brown one. The season opened a battlefield, with the narrative built around the legend of King Arthur, continuing the exploration into the mysterious nature of the Doctor's past, with the antagonists recognising him as the wizard Merlin. However, it was never properly acknowledged whether the Doctor being Merlin is from his past, future, or alternative timeline, but the link to the character only adds to the mystery of who the Doctor may or may not be. Following story Ghostlight, which was the last of the classic series to be filmed, begins the deepening of Ace's character that had been explored in her debut Dragonfire, and developed further in Remembrance of the Daleks and the Greatest Show in the Galaxy by looking into her vulnerability and fears, as well as exploring her maturity into a young woman. The overall narrative of Ghostlight evolved from a story set on Gallifrey from writer Mark Platt, but instead the finished version is set within a Victorian house on Earth instead. With a vague and at times confusing narrative, it provides some focus over to Ace, who finds the house full of evil and tells the Doctor how she burnt down a similar house in her hometown when she was younger, only to discover that the Doctor had purposely brought her to that same house a century earlier to both discover what made the house evil and the most obvious notion of the Doctor manipulating and testing of Ace for something further down the line. Whatever you may think of the narrative of Ghostlight, its strength lies more in the exploration of the Doctor and Ace's relationship and how it differs from anything else that had been done previously in the show's history. The third story is Season 26, The Curse of Fenric, is perhaps one of the most laid narratives in Doctor Who history, and as such is one of my all-time favourite stories. The Doctor's mysterious past and Ace's troubled character here become entwined, and before the audience's very eyes we are presented with a sort of conclusion to a story arc that had virtually been occurring without being direct, in comparison to some of the post-2005 story arcs that we get today. Set on a military base during the Second World War, it deals with the Doctor readying to finish a battle against the godlike entity Fenric after trapping him hundreds of years earlier. Writer Ian Briggs, who also wrote Dragonfire, the story that introduced Ace to the series, presents a narrative that reveals that Ace had indirectly been used as a pawn by Fenric, who was responsible for bringing her and the Doctor together. Ace's troubled relationship with her mother is also exploited by Fenric as the military base setting brings into confrontation with her mother as a baby, but who she became attached to, and inadvertently sends her infant mother and grandmother to Perivale, which is Ace's hometown. Narrative also further challenges the Doctor and Ace's relationship when the Doctor is aware of Fenric's work and puts Ace to a false sense of hating the Doctor, of him manipulating her, in order for the Doctor to finally defeat his foe. Whilst not answering all the questions, The Curse of Fenric certainly ties up some loose ends about the character relationship between the Doctor and Ace, as well as their own individual developments. However, it is unclear if this was planned all the way back in Dragonfire, or whether Cartmel and Ian Briggs saw The Curse of Fenric as the ideal opportunity to drive the overall Masterplan to fruition and focus. The final story of Season 26, and ultimately the classic series, Survival, is less about the mystery of the Doctor and his relationship with Ace, but more about his companion coming home with a lot of her demons now seemingly conquered with the events of over the last 2 seasons. Arriving in her hometown of Perivale, Ace deals with the consequences of what she left behind when Fenric moved her across the universe, as she being regarded as a missing person. However, a lot of her friends have also disappeared, but in different circumstances, as they have been snatched to another planet by the Cheetah People, who are controlled by the Master. With Ace, the narrative finally forms a bridge of her now being a young woman, as she starts falling under the influence of the planet of the Cheetah People in a similar manner to her friend Midge and the Master himself. Writer Rona Monroe also later revealed to have a lesbian sub-narrative regarding Ace and one of the Cheetah People called Kara, who was later revealed to have originally been human. As for the Doctor, for once in this season, he is in a situation where he is not fully aware of what is already happening, and is acting more out of kindness and honesty towards Ace by bringing her to Perivale now that his reasons for his manipulation have been made clear. This also lends itself to him being at a disadvantage when he comes in confrontation with his arch-nemesis unexpectedly, who in turn had been observing the Doctor. By the end, Ace is ready to move on from her past, with all her demons excised, and carry on travelling with the Doctor, who has once again defeated the Master. Ultimately, it will prove to be the end of the classic series, and is presented in a fitting way, especially with the speech made by the Doctor pinned at the end. However, this wouldn't have been envisioned earlier on during the writings of the scripts of Season 26, and Andrew Cartmel's larger vision, which leaves some of the narratives left open for what would have been Season 27. But how would this played out as the conclusion of what became known as the Cartmel Masterplan? Despite Doctor Who being cancelled at the end of Season 26, producer John Nathan Turner and script editor Andrew Cartmel had already made plans for what would have been Season 27 that would have lightly tied up his so-called Masterplan. Although there wasn't a definitive endgame for the mysterious suggested background of the Doctor, there was one in line for Ace, with Sophie Aldred having expressed a desire to move on had Season 27 come to fruition. This would involve the Doctor having taken his companion to Gallifrey to become a Time Lord and join the High Council, with her rebellious attitude help reshape the Time Lord's policies in safeguarding time and space. This would, in the end, ultimately explain why the Doctor had been manipulating his companion as a means of training and preparation for her future. As for Sylvester McCoy, Season 27 may or may not have been his last, with no definitive decision made by the Doctor would have had regenerated in the final story. However, had that occurred, then it would have been a difficult task to tie up any loose ends regarding the 7th Doctor persona had production decided to. Other ideas for Season 27 including the return of the Ice Warriors in 1960s London, a new companion possibly called Kate who had the ability to crack safes, as well as potential stories involving Cybermen, alien inhabiting corpses, and arms dealers, which further lent to Doctor Who tackling more adult narratives than it had done previously. Whatever would have come of this, though, it would have been without Andrew Cartmel, who, after the conclusion of season 26, had been headhunted by the BBC production team of the medical drama Casualty to take over script editing duties on their show. You would imagine, though, that his long-term plans would have remained largely intact, and that Ben Aronovich or Mark Platt, whose stories strongly contributed to Cartmel's ideologies, could have taken over from script editing duties. John Nathan Turner would have more than likely stayed on as producer, however, he may have moved on too at the end of season 27. In the past, he had expressed his desire to leave the show, but ended up staying as at the time there was no suitable or willing candidate to take on his role. Although Andrew Cartmel's vision never came to a conclusion in a TV medium, it did carry on throughout the 1990s with the introduction of Virgin Novels' The New Adventures, which took on more adult-orientated narratives and explored the Doctor's manipulative nature deeper, with contributions coming from Cartmel himself, Ben Aronovich, and Mark Platt, as well as future writers Russell T Davies, Mark Gatiss, and Paul Cornell. Through these novels, the whole nature and background of the Doctor that had been a focal point of the Seventh Doctor era would have been explained and concluded with the final novel, Longbarrow, written by Mark Platt. The Sylvester McCoy era of Doctor Who had all been about changing the way the stories were told under the ever more challenging situations set by the BBC. Season 24, which was largely without Andrew Cartmel's input, was seemingly put together just to get a season out on TV, and in my opinion, is one of the worst seasons of the classic era. Seasons 25 and 26, however, saw a shift of focus on character, with Ace seemingly growing up and maturing whilst being subjected to the Doctor's manipulation. As for the Doctor himself, a character that had been a constant presence for over 20 years, albeit under different incarnations, seemingly had a freshness brought upon him with the mystery and an emphasis literally on the who in Doctor Who. There was no longer the Doctor and his companion stumbling into a scenario accidentally, the companion acting as an audience representation by asking for an explanation, and the Doctor also having to come to the rescue of this companion. Although these narrative traits were still present in places, they were mainly replaced with the unique chemistry of the Doctor and Ace of the manipulation, question and trust, and each other virtually being equally integral to the narrative, both short and long term. Ace's development as a character provides a welcome shift also to more personally and emotional situations to the character, as opposed to the saving the universe. This couldn't have worked though without the chemistry between Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred, and their understanding of each other, which is reminiscent of the acting and relationships between Patrick Troughton and Fraser Hines, John Pertwee and Katie Manning, and Tom Baker and Elizabeth Sladen. One of the criticisms of classic Doctor Who was that the narrative contained plenty of padding in order to justify the 4 more episodes a story would normally consist of. However, with the BBC having reduced the season down to 14 episodes since 1986, there was no longer the luxury of slowly peeling back the layers of a narrative and instead getting straight into the mix. A prime example of this was the lack of TARDIS scenes, which had been popular during the 1980s, but something that Andrew Cartmel had regarded as soap opera and wasn't keen on. Another reason for the lack of TARDIS scenes, though, could also be put down to the budget, with the set having started to deteriorate and there not being enough money to upgrade it. Budgets had always been a problem during classic Doctor Who, and perhaps more so during the Seventh Doctor era. John Nathan Turner wasn't without criticism, but part of his manifesto of becoming producer in 1980 was to alter the mindset of previous regimes of allowing the sets and effects to look as cheap as the budget suggested, and while Nathan Turner did at times fall victim to this during his tenure, he wasn't short of inventiveness or trying to avoid that cheap look. One of the ways of stretching the budget during the Seventh Doctor era was by electing not only for stories shot purely in the studio, which was common, but also stories that were shot purely on location. This wasn't a new concept to Doctor Who, but one that had previously been done as a last resort. But with the Seventh Doctor, it became the new norm of stretching the budget, when applied correctly and appropriately. This gave the stories a new sense of realism and believability. And to me, the 2 best examples of this are The Curse of Fenric, with an authentic feeling World War II military base setting, and Survival, with the suburban setting of Perivale actually being filmed in Perivale itself, bringing a humble feeling to Ace's origins when she returns home. Despite all the promise of the Cartmel Masterplan and new ideas being pumped into the show, the ratings didn't reflect this, and over Sylvester McCoy's 3 seasons, there was a steady decline. This was enough for the BBC to make the decision to bring Doctor Who's continuous run on television to an end after 26 years. That run is impressive in itself in the history of British television, in particular with the close run-ins that it had with the BBC hierarchy over the years, in particular during the 1980s. It somewhat felt ironic that the moment Doctor Who had found its footing and fresh ideas, the BBC had decided to pull the plug on the show at the point that they did. The person who made the call was BBC One controller Jonathan Powell, who felt that the show needed a rest instead of permanent cancellation, and the show would struggle in comparison to US science fiction shows such as Star Trek The Next Generation and Quantum Leap, which the BBC had started to import. You can guess that in my opinion, I feel that the BBC brought Doctor Who off the air at the wrong time, and can only imagine that rather than closely looking at the improvement of quality of storytelling, they had chosen their moment to put the final nail in the coffin, which felt like their ultimate ulterior motive since 1986, when their last attempt to put the show on hiatus had been thwarted, and their reaction was to put the show on a slow death by fighting for viewers for Coronation Street. A more favourable schedule slot, though, I feel, would have helped the show, in particular its ratings, and maybe the BBC would have changed their mind. I agree that from a budget perspective, it would have looked a lesser quality in terms of the look of the comparison of US imports, but this wasn't necessarily a new competition for Doctor Who, and the show's committed and passionate following would have surely helped the show prevail as it tried to bring back audiences who had previously left. Ultimately, fans got their wish firstly with a false start of the TV movie starring Paul McCann as the Eighth Doctor in 1996, but eventually in 2005 when once more the show became a permanent fixture on Saturday night television on BBC One. Although I feel that Doctor Who was brought off air at the wrong time while it was in the process of telling a long-term story arc, I personally can't decide if the proposed ideas that came to light in the new adventures would have had a positive outlook had they made it into TV instead, and whether the so-called Cartmel Masterplan would have been ultimately tarnished. Although efforts have been made by the production team to reinvigorate the mystery of the Doctor's character, there is a feel that the narrative structure would have required a revelation to this mystery, which was somewhat brought about in the New Adventures novels. That, in itself, would have brought the whole concept of the mystery of the Doctor's background back to square one, with the revelation having expelled that mystery itself. To me, the biggest disappointment was that Ace, one of the show's greatest companions, never got closure to her story in a TV format. This was somewhat addressed in the 13th Doctor story The Power of the Doctor, but the fact that her endgame was never broadcast left an overhanging question mark over the character, with ourselves as fans ultimately having to draw our own conclusions from alternative medias. To many, the Seventh Doctor's era represented a time when classic Doctor Who was on its last legs and barely piecing together stories in order to survive, resulting in casual fans and viewers moving on and only the die-hard Whovians still carrying a torch for the show. To me, apart from the underwhelming start with season 24, the Seventh Doctor era represents the last hurrah of classic Doctor Who. It showcases the resilient nature of the show that refused to die and go away, by bringing in new ideas and narrative and characters, which ultimately goes a long way to underline the show's longevity. Yes, the BBC did call it a day on Doctor Who in 1989, but over the long term that proved to be the end of a chapter, not the story, in Doctor Who's history. Sylvester McCoy may not be littered with all-time classics or represent a golden era of Doctor Who, but those stories that buy into Andrew Cartmel's visions, such as Remembrance of the Daleks and The Curse of Fenric, stand up strong against some of the all-time favourites, and in the end represent a much underappreciated era of the show. Don't take my word for it though. Go and re-watch these stories and let your curiosity take you away. But for now, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.